So what's up, everyone? We are back for another episode of the Pair Program. I am your host, Tim Winkler, accompanied by my co-host, Mike Gruen. Mike, what's going on?
Not much. I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm good. Good. Are you excited that Elon Musk is now the owner of Twitter? Did you guys see that the video he posted carrying the sink into the?
I was there like a joke I missed there? Why was he carrying a sink? I didn't get it.
He basically said you can't help but let that sink in. That was his joke.
That's terrible.
I'm going to be honest. I think I've only followed the memes of Elon buying Twitter. I don't know if I'm actually up to date on the news. That's on my to-do list later.
Kind of converge, There's not a lot of...
Right. Cool. Well, let's give the listeners a quick heads up on today's episode. So this is the second episode of a mini series that we're calling, from FAANG to Founder. Within this episode, we're going to be talking to startup founders who've previously worked for big tech companies like Facebook or Square, and getting some insight into what translates over into startup world or what doesn't translate at all. So we've got two great guests joining us today, both of which have worked in numerous environments that span large and small. Confident they'll bring some great insight, perspective to our discussion. So Tomas, Yasyf, thanks for spending time with us on the Pair Program.
Thanks for having us.
For sure. All right. So before we dive into the discussion, we do kick things off with a fun segment called Pair Me Up. Here's where we're going to go around the room. Shout out a complimentary pairing. Mike, you always tee us off. So what do you got for us today?
So today I'm going with software engineers and free swag because it's just what you do. My entire wardrobe, as people who watch the podcast know, is based on free swag.
So true. I feel like companies are getting pretty creative with swag, though. Like it's not, they're trying to stay modern with some of it. Is there any like a piece of swag that you'd say is like?
I have a deck of cards.
A pack of cigarettes?
No, deck of cards. And
deck of cards.
Giant like water bottle. Like a good one, like a
nice,
like a Yeti type, like nice, but like heavy duty, even bigger. I don't know. I don't really care. I just like the t-shirts and the sweatshirts. Like everything else just ends up eventually going in the trash.
Like I go through where it's like I have a bunch of like free swag, and then someone convinces me I should wear better clothing, but then companies come up with better swag, so it's like constant race.
Right. Like Mike, how soft is that hat shirt?
I mean, this shirt is nice. It's very comfortable. Yeah. I don't get to wear it on the podcast that often because usually I'm just wearing it,
Yeah, we send every engineer that we place a swag pack, so they always get a shirt. And one of my in-laws saw one in the wild at like a Wegmans and took a picture. I was like,
"Oh, that's awesome!
That's great.
Yeah, that's pretty cool."
Awesome.
The socks are nice too, although nobody gets to see them.
Yeah, socks are cool.
Have you seen any Graphite swag in the wild yet?
Have I seen Graphite swag in the wild? Yeah, I have not. I mean, it's still small enough that I know everyone at the company. And so I feel our best swag is employees only. And you kind of, it when you see one of your coworkers. I think it'd be weirder if I was like, whoa, cool, Graphite swag. Who are you? No, nothing yet. It's hard to stay on top of swag though. We keep trying to think of like, what can we do that would be creative and exciting for people? Because I feel almost every item that you can do swag about has been done at this point.
The Magic 8 Balls were pretty creative.
That one we did. We'll get into this, I'm sure. We do code review. And so we did a Magic 8 Ball for possible answers to code review of looks good to me, like who's on call, things like that. Which
works on my machine.
Like that a lot. Yeah, exactly. It works locally. Things like that.
That's funny. Swag Up, actually, we'll plug them. We use them as a vendor, and they kind of crush it in terms of like giving you ideas in different sectors. So cool. Well, we aren't here to just talk swag today. We will get into our topic. First, I'll jump into my pairing. So my pairing is going to be kitchen renovations and takeout. So my wife and I were renovating our kitchen currently. It's a pretty massive undertaking at this point. It's tearing down some walls, new appliances, cabinets, the whole deal. And so like throughout this process, we've been we lived in an Airbnb for a week during the demo, and now we're back in the house, but we're about 2 weeks away from the kitchen actually being functional. So we've pretty much been living on Grubhub and takeout for the last 10 days, and will be for the next couple weeks. But I mean, it's not a terrible thing, but you do eventually miss those home cooked meals. Well, not the healthiest stint that I'm on, but yeah, I'll do kitchen renos and takeout.
I'll be honest. I think there are a lot of software engineers that probably also live on Grubhub who are not having their kitchen renovated.
It's fine.
That's a good point. Software engineers and Grubhub. That's the other.
That's the pretty good one.
Cool. Let's pass it to our guest and get their quick intro and their pairing. So Tomas, why don't you kick it off first?
Hi everyone. My name is Tomas. I'm one of the co-founders of Graphite. Graphite's a code review company here based in New York. My pairing for you all, I think, is going to be fall weather and hot apple cider. We are having some beautiful, beautiful fall days right now, and I am constantly going out and finding new hot apple cider joints, which is very fun.
Awesome.
You got to pair that with a cinnamon donut. That's my 2 cents on that.
That's solid. Yeah. And maybe a splash of bourbon in the cider.
9 a.m. hot apple cider bourbon. That's the pairing.
No, that's more of an 8:30 a.m. That's
good stuff. Yeah, that's solid, man. Yasyf, how about yourself?
I've been on an ice cream kick recently. I've been trying all the different ice cream spots around San Francisco. And my favorite flavor I've tried so far has been saffron ice cream. So I'm going to go with saffron and ice cream.
Oh, it's interesting.
An unexpected one was pretty good.
Yeah. You just bypassed an intro. We don't even hear the intro. Just talk about saffron and ice cream. That's great.
Ice cream is obviously much more important. But the less important part, I'm Yasyf. I've been the founder of a few different companies. Most recently, a company called Sim. We're building an automation tool for security engineering teams.
Nice. Awesome. So I'm going to jump into our intro here. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about from FAANG to founder, and we strategically chose both of our guests kind of given their diverse experience. I'm just going to jump into this, start with you first, Tomas. If you want to maybe shed a little bit more light for our listeners on kind of your journey up to your current role as a founder of Graphite, and what were some of those things that you as you're making that transition from a larger environment like Facebook to Graphite, and then we'll dive into your experience, Yasyf.
Yeah, happy to. So my name's Tomas. As I said before before Graphite, I was at Facebook. I was there for 3 years. I think I have a different path than a lot of startup founders. If I actually love Facebook, I guess now Meta, although I never worked there while it was called that. I had a great time there. I originally went there not at all expecting that I would enjoy it. I sort of was like, I really need to go learn how to do software engineering. I think Facebook would be a wonderful place to have an internship. I'll go there and then maybe one day do a startup, because I know I was always interested in sort of what impact could you have? And that was exciting. I went to Facebook. I really loved it there. I love the people I worked with. I love the technology I worked on. I love the problems I got to solve. I worked on internal product infrastructure. So figuring out how to accelerate product development, which is just a passion area of mine. I thought I was going to stay there for a long time, honestly. I think that within that first year, I remember so distinctly when I joined the company, I put on my calendar, at 11 months, give notice, 12 months, leave the company, 13 months. Why are you still here if you are? And I blew past all of those. And I remember when it happened. I remember on my 2-year Faceanniversary, which is Facebook celebrates your 1 anniversary of the company 2 year. My manager wrote me a card being I did not think we would get here. I am so surprised that we have managed to keep you this long. I loved it there, but what ultimately pulled me out was Meryl and Greg. So I am one of 3 co-founders. The 3 of us chose to start Graphite March 6th of 2020. Awful timing. We can talk about that at any point. It was about 7 days before a global pandemic was declared. For those of you that don't know that, I remember it was of all times to leave. It was definitely an interesting one. It was them that pulled me out. So I think they were 2 close friends from college. Greg and I had been sort of project partners in every class in school, and so we programmed operating systems together, graphics together, pick it, compilers, functional programming, doesn't really matter. Meryl was a few years older than us. So he had gone through YC. He had dropped out of Harvard to go through YC. exited his company, came back to finish his degree. And he was always more of a mentor figure. So he was more plugged into venture and startups, just given that background. And he was the one who sort of like taught Greg and I the way, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So he was like, oh, like, this is how venture works. This is how startups work. And so we had stayed close as we left college, moved to New York, worked at various tech companies. And I think when they were like, yeah, we're going to do a startup, I was like, this is not an opportunity I can miss. This is a story that I'm excited to be a part of. And so I made the choice to leave. And it was interesting. I had known, for me, I think the journey was, I'd known I wanted to go to startup. I went to Facebook. I was like, well, maybe I could see myself staying here for a while. And then it was ultimately them that pulled me back out.
So your other two co-founders, they didn't work at Facebook with you, but you knew them through college?
Exactly right. Okay. So Greg graduated college, went to Airbnb. He was on their infrastructure team for quite some time. He read notifications there, which is a very impressive feat. Merrill, after school, he after his company got acquired, he went to Square for a hot second, enjoyed it, eventually decided to finish his degree. Went to Oscar in New York, following some old coworkers who he really liked. And then after Oscar, he worked at a handful of startups here while he wasn't as sure whether he was going to found again versus just to be early in that journey. And honestly, I think it took some convincing to be like, yeah, this is right time, right place, right team to go and take the leap again, because it's definitely a scary thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's you had alluded to this in our intro call a month ago about when it's the right time to leave. So you were at Facebook, you said, for about 3 years, and do you think that timing was kind of dictated based on the startup idea had kind of like you had finally felt like it was ready to make that leap, or you were just like, hey, I've kind of put in my time at Facebook, I'm now, I need to do something different. Was there like an in-between space there, or were you with Facebook up until that very last day and first day that you started Graphite?
I'll be totally honest. I think that there's a real chance if those two hadn't started a company, I'd still be at Facebook. I quite enjoyed my time there. I know they've gone through some tough times recently, but I really enjoyed the people more than anything there. My old team and I are still friends. We still hang out. I'll echo a piece of startup wisdom that I've heard, which is that for an early stage startup, you're looking for some amount of idea, team, and market. And I think that for us, what we had there was, I felt so strongly in the team that I was willing to forgo the other two. I was like, this team is going to do something exciting. I want to be a part of this. The idea and market, I think that we had in retrospect, we had some work to do there. But for me, it was really the team that was like, yeah, this makes it time to leave.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I think what's also interesting about your journey is, the startup that you're leading at Graphite and the product that you're building. This was, a lot of what inspired this was some of the work that you're doing at Facebook. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the story up until March 2020. So we leave March 2020 and we start working on mobile release tooling. We had a theory that, if you look at the biggest companies, you see a whole lot of spend on things like QA. And if you look at the smallest companies, you see none of it. And there isn't really an incremental path. It seems like at one point the switch flips and then people start spending a lot here. Mm-hmm. And that felt like a place where, we can help make higher quality software. And so we started building it. Back then, the company was called Screenplay. I was fortunate enough to hire two of my old coworkers. What was really interesting was when they joined, they felt something which I had felt as well, which was, we missed Facebook's internal tooling. It's not quite like, I'm not going to go ahead and say Facebook's internal tooling is better than the tooling we have out here in the wild. It's certainly different. But I think just the comparison got us to be much more thoughtful around things like code review, where I think a lot of people out in the wild, I'll say, outside of a big company, look at code review and they're like, oh, GitHub does that. So like, I think that's all we need. And I think for us, coming from Facebook, we were like, there's so much in this workflow that doesn't make sense, doesn't work for us, could be iterated on, et cetera. And so we started to build this out internally ourselves. We just built like scripts. Eventually, we built the web dashboard. We had a CLI, which was the first first version of Graphite, so to speak.
Cool.
It was our old colleagues. Eventually, I think a lot of them had a similar experience. They had been at Facebook. They'd seen different tooling. They're like, hey, how are people doing, like, adjusting to this? A lot of our experience wasn't so unique. And we were like, oh, like, we built a thing for this. Does anyone want it? And the response we got was like, yes, absolutely. Like, I definitely need this. What can we do? And at the time, we were working on a different company, right? Same corporate entity, but different product. And we were like, oh, we have like a different product. Go use that one. This is not meant for other people to use it. It was, at the time, it was hard coded with our repo names, hard coded with our usernames. The idea of isolation wasn't really there. It was an internal tool. And we had enough people tell us like, no, this is a thing we need, that in August of 2021, we decided to be like, okay, let's do an experiment here. Let's just see what happens. We'll take 20 people into a beta, and we'll figure out how to make our very janky system work what they did with whatever they had. What was crazy to me was how many people we got to sign up. So we got like 38 very thoughtful responses being like, no, I need to be a part of this beta. Like, I have been struggling with tooling since I left primarily Facebook. We started in a Facebook alumni group was where we made this posting. I think that better does exist. I really want access to your tool because it looks like the right thing. And so we got 38 of those like emails or messages in general. We were like, fine, we were planning for 20. We'll take 38. That was August. That 38 grew to 60 some pretty naturally. So we didn't try to grow the product at all in the early days. We were just like, so August happens, we get these 38. I think by the end of it, we had pretty much decided that we were going to pivot, but we had a lot of work to do before we could release this generally. It grew to 68 pretty naturally. These were just people who were like, yeah, my coworker saw what I have and really wants it. Can you add them? And we're like, fine, that'll be fine. November, we launched a public waitlist. We were expecting about 500 signups. We posted on Hacker News. We ended up with about 3,500 signups overnight. And I remember that day was super exciting. We had hooked it up such that our Slack buzzed every time we got a sign up. And especially just by the evening, it was just like, bzz, 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 and we were like, what is happening? This is so cool. And that led us then, that led us through a lot of growth until the beginning of the year, which is when we were pretty sure this was the right direction. By then we had grown far past sort of Facebook. That was a wonderful initial cohort for us. They shared a language. The features that they wanted was clear. A lot of them wanted the same exact features that we were used to. But eventually we learned to speak the language of Googlers and then people who had been at Twitter, Uber, or whatever. And then we kept growing. So anyway, that's the short version. We raised a round of funding early this year from Andreessen. We raised about $20 million.
Awesome.
We are working on making the product experience really, really phenomenal. We're still behind a wait list because we really want to make sure it's perfect before we release it generally, but we're hoping to do that sometime next year.
That's cool that that experience at Facebook had also allowed for this kind of almost like this product validation as well. So
it's really funny. I think the internal tool at a big company to a startup is certainly a tried and true path. And it's funny to tell this story now in retrospect, because I remember I went to Facebook to quote learn real software engineering. And I think one of the things I did learn was like how can code review like be different? Because I think a lot of people I'm very fortunate in the team we have now. As I said earlier, we have about 15 people. I think everyone here is very thoughtful around the process, and we come from all sorts of different companies. We come from Shopify and Mongo, Adobe, Google, and it's cool to have a lot of people in the room who we do code review all the time, right, every day. But what's funny is the conversations you'll hear in the office is like, you haven't reviewed my PR. And then it's like, how could the product make this easier to do? Right. Like it's a meta thoughtfulness to the process that we're doing day in and day out of like, oh, we had an incident. How could we have caught that in code review? Why didn't the product do that for me? And so it's this meta analysis of engineering as a discipline.
Ultimate dogfooding.
So Yasyf, you've been a multi-startup founder. However, your exposure in big tech environments, aside from looked like a few internships with companies like Square and Facebook, is actually a little bit more minimal. So I'd love to hear from your perspective on maybe why did you elect to bypass a longer term journey with one of these bigger companies and instead kind of jump into your own thing?
Yeah, totally. Can you guys hear me, by the way? Okay,
yeah,
great. It was technology struggling a little bit. Yeah, so I think I had, actually, funnily enough, like pretty similar experience to Tomas in terms of like I actually really did enjoy my time at the bigger companies during the short stints I did there. And I think my motivation for leaving was actually pretty different. So, I spent time at Square and at Facebook, and it was cool. It was cool to see how productive people could be in an environment where there was all this tooling built for them. And that's one of the things I really love about Graphite and what Tomas and them are working on now is that they're kind of democratizing access to that amazing tooling that you normally only have access to at a really big company. And so that was definitely an enjoyable experience. I think for me, the answer is a lot simpler. I'm not a very good employee. And so as anyone who's worked with me will attest to, and it was very hard for me to be motivated. I'm the kind of person where if I'm going to work on something, I'm going to like pour everything into it. And it's very hard for me to be motivated by doing that kind of towards someone else's goals. And so for me, it became almost like, how do I recreate some of those like really amazing environments that I experienced at bigger companies, at my own companies, on my own teams. I remember my first company out of grad school was a healthcare company with a friend who had worked at Google before. And I remember the two of us were always trying to think like, oh, like we did this at Google, how can we bring that in? Or we did this at Square, let's try to do that. Or like this didn't work at Facebook, how do we prevent that? And so I think it was even just those few years of experience at the bigger companies, seeing what works and what doesn't work, really inspired what we were bringing to kind of the culture and the tools of our earlier stage companies. But I think it's kind of like a trial and error process, right? Because some things kind of translate and some things don't. And I wish there had been more tools like Graphite around to kind of help with that transition, because we were kind of building all of these things from scratch, as was every other startup we knew who had people from a bigger company.
Mm-hmm. Let's peel that back a little bit more. So you're saying like some things that translate and some things that don't. I think those are some of those things that I want to dissect a little bit. So what off the top of your head, I mean, you talked a little bit about like some of those like processes and tool access to those tooling processes and things. But so Yasyf, what were some of those things that you felt like, translated over into startup world? And then what are those things that maybe like, you'd want to drop I
think I kind of split into two pieces, like the tooling and the process. On the tooling side, I think almost everything we'd experienced at Facebook, at Square, at Google would have been useful in a smaller environment. Like a lot of the automation, a lot of the, hey, you could just push some code and it magically gets everywhere it needs to be. You don't have to worry about how that happens. And all the like, automations around like, hey, you forgot to test this, or hey, you should go find this person and sign off on this. Like a lot of that stuff around whether it was code review or deployment or anything else was super helpful. And I think would have translated well to the earlier days of the company. I think the trap we fell into there is it was really tempting to try to go recreate and rebuild all of that, because our heads it was like, oh, the only environment we know that's been really productive is the environment with all of these different tools. And so let's go build a completely automated CI/CD process from day one. Let's go build a bunch of code review bots, go build a bunch of Slack bots. And as it turns out, a lot of that stuff is not the most important thing to be building when you have 3 months of runway left and you're struggling to stay alive as a company. And B, and this is a motivation for both, Sim and Graphite, it's the same stuff everyone else is building at their early stage companies. It kind of feels like a waste. So that was kind of the tooling side. And then on the kind of process side, I think two mistakes that early founders kind of make. One is, this was such a great, practice at, insert big company here, so we should do that as well right away here. And I think one of the big dangers of early stage company when you have this later stage experience is introducing too much process, right? So it was so tempting. We started our first company to be like, okay, we got to hire all these different people to lead these departments because Square had a head of each of these departments, right. And we need a full HR process and all this stuff. And it really it makes it really easy to kind of play house, right? You spend more time like doing things you think a company should have than actually building your company. In reality, a pre-seed company is like a few people in a room, doing everything they can to make sure the company sees the light of day tomorrow. And there's no time to kind of play house, but it's very tempting to do when you start borrowing these processes from bigger companies. So I think the good learning there was like, keep that stuff in mind, but introduce it when appropriate, which is actually a pretty hard thing to gauge. And Tomas, I'm sure you guys have seen this as well. And then the flip side of it is there's some really awesome things that would be amazing to bring, but like you don't realize how intentionally some of these companies have worked to build a culture supporting it. So a great example I could think of is at Square. It's kind of like email transparency process where like almost all the emails from the execs would get like auto forwarded to these different mailing lists.
Oh,
so
interesting.
you could, I don't know if they still do this, but it's really cool. I was there pre-IPO, and if you were curious about like what anyone high up at the company was kind of spending their day on, you could literally go read their emails. And it was wild practice of kind of like radical transparency, but it really helped people feel more connected in the loop. And I mean, it seemed like an awesome idea. Like everyone enjoyed it so much. We tried doing that at Karuna, my first company, and it was a disaster because we realized like you have to be very thoughtful about like keeping your audience in mind when you're writing those emails, and you have to have a culture where there's just such high trust where you can do that. And it turns out that like the 3 people you hired yesterday that have never worked with you before aren't exactly in that high trust mode from day one. And so it was one of those things that felt so effortless when you see it working, but when you try to recreate it yourself, you realize, oh, this is like a multi-year process to get there.
Yeah, there's certain things in like those early stages that just, they got to be a little more discreet about, right? Because, there's a level of setting expectations, and then there's like, what's really happening as well. There could be certain things that, people would run for the hills if they knew like specifics on finances or something, right? And it's like,
yeah, actually, I want to push back on that a little bit because I think I'm curious to get Tomas's take on this too, but I'm actually a really big fan of being as transparent as possible with that stuff in the early days. I find it actually does breed a lot of trust, and like, if there's like secrets, like dark secrets, people are going to find them. I'd rather be upfront about them. So I think it's less about not being transparent about some of those scary things, more about what is the right way to present them so that someone has all the context. Because I think it's very easy to kind of like mention something ad hoc or kind of like assuming everyone has shared context, and the people hearing that could like really misunderstand, right? So like using your example, like there could be something that's kind of scary with the finances, but like, kind of scary to me is like we only have 12 months of runway, right?
Yeah,
someone might hear kind of scary and be like, oh my God, we're going to run out of money next week, right? And so I think more about like making sure people have the right context when you share that stuff as one example of things that like you really have to spend time building a culture around.
Sure. And some of those things like you kind of screen for to, if you're coming to a startup, it's like, you kind of want to be, aware that there's risk here, right? There's might not be the most cush and comfortable from a financial perspective. Otherwise, you maybe be at Facebook here. But yeah, I do want to get Tomas's input on this as well. Yeah. So Tomas, some of those things that you felt like you needed to kind of unlearn coming from Facebook into the startup world.
Well, first I'm going to answer your transparency question, then I'm going to come back to that one. So transparency, I think my 2 cents on this one is I think in the early days, actually there's like very little in the facts I think was scary. I think like we made a good policy of open door from the beginning of like, yeah, like if you want to understand anything we can legally share, we're happy to. The like one exception to that being like your coworkers' salaries. I don't think we can legally tell you. But like the rest of it, yeah, we're happy to talk around sort of like how we think about the company, how conversations with investors are going, what people are telling us. The thing I felt we had to learn to do in terms of communication transparency was disagree productively. Because imagine working with your friends on like, this is your baby, right? Like this is the project that all of you care more about than anything else in your life. And like you're working in a high ambiguity space. And so you're going to come up with these tensions of like, well, like, we could do X or we could do Y. And to all of you, it feels like the most important decision that you can make. I think one of the things that we've learned, which is for better or for worse, is like a healthy level of apathy, where we've learned, I think, like it used to be the case that every decision was the most important decision we were about to make. So every decision was so high stakes. And these days, there are a lot of decisions we make candidly where we're like, probably doesn't matter. Like, yeah, like it'll affect something, but most things are recoverable. And so it's like, it's fine. Like, take a stab. We'll see what happens, and then we can move from there. And learning to take things with that like level of removedness, or perhaps it's just wisdom, has really changed some things. Anyway, to answer your now original question of what have I had to unlearn, it's actually really funny to me in that I think so when I joined Facebook, I joined a team of 6. That team grew to 30 with me as sort of like the scope of the team grew, what we were doing grew on it. And that's a lot closer to our Series A than it is our seed. So our Series A, we started with 6 people. We're planning to grow to 39 by the end of next year. We're now, if you've ever been in this space, we're, as I said earlier, we're at 15 people. We're just now starting to have this conversation of like, how do we split into teams or pods, which is a conversation I vividly remember having at Facebook. And what's funny to me is like in many ways, it feels easier to me if I had started here, because I clearly see the parallels of like, oh, this is how we did this at Facebook. This is what might make sense at a startup. And this is what doesn't make sense at a startup and what we should change. The seed was entirely different. The seed was this game of working and sort of, we describe it as like hunting through the fog of trying to figure out like, okay, do we have product market fit? To building a team, or as Yasyf said, like finding new heads of whatever position is not the relevant bit.
Right.
And so there was so much more to learn there. And I think we benefited immensely from the fact that Merrill had done that before. So I think Greg and I both came from larger companies, Facebook and Airbnb. We came in and we were like, yeah, of course we need to, as Yasyf said, like set up all of these processes, because every productive company I've had has had like productive whatever, has had automated CI. And of course you need automated CI in order to find product market fit. And I think that when you've done it before, when you've seen that, you're like, no, that's not what matters. Like, let's focus on finding users that give any shit about what we're doing. And then we can go ahead and set this all up. And so there's a part of me which reflects on that. It's nice though, because I've had the advantage of not having to think about this alone. As I said, I hired 2 of my old coworkers, and so we regularly ask sort of like what's different. A few beats which keep coming up. One is, I think everyone will agree with you at an earlier stage company, you learn more. Just like you have to do it. People used to ask me like, well, where does the space for like mentorship or teaching happen at a startup? And my truthful answer is like, I would ask the same question of a big company, because I feel at a big company, it's like, we have this big project and we need someone who's senior or staff in order to do it. And so we have this pool of E5s and E6s that we'll pull from. At a startup, it's like, who's going to do this big project? And we're like, we only have you in the room. So you're going to do the big project. And we're going to throw everything we have to make sure that you can do this big project, because otherwise we're screwed.
It's takes learning too, right? Like at a startup, every new thing you take on is necessarily sink or swim, because if it's not like super crucial, you wouldn't be working on it, right? Whereas a lot of things at bigger companies where it's like, yeah, this would be great if we did this, but it's not going to be company ending if we mess it up, right?
Yeah.
But I think it forces you to learn on a much steeper curve, because you literally don't have a choice
and focus on what's really actionable and important to the company at large. So one of the traps we've seen, with hiring, for instance, and it's always an interesting pivot once you hit like the say like that 15 to 30 headcount mark, is this title of VP of engineering, right? You usually think like, okay, there's the CTO, there's that next layer is that VP, but when you really need a VP is oftentimes later on down the line, where what you really need in those early stages is somebody who's actually really hands on, and not this big inflated title that is just kind of running the show. I've seen it as well where just because you were one of like the OG hires that came in doesn't necessarily mean that you should still be like that VP when that time's right. You might not have those skills that translate to the company when it's at that larger stage. And that can be a tricky thing to navigate. I don't know if you guys have seen that before, but those are some things that we've seen as an interesting like growth hurdle.
Yeah,
I believe that.
Go ahead,
Yasyf.
I was going to say, as someone who spent the better part of last year hiring a VPE, I probably have some thoughts on this. I think a couple things. I think one, that like echoing what Tomas said earlier, this is another one of those things where like it's so much easier the second time around.
Yeah.
Like there's all these things you realize like basic mistakes to avoid. And I mean, a lot of the time I spend now is like angel investing and advising early founders. And I feel like a lot of that time is just spent telling them like, this thing doesn't matter. This thing doesn't matter.
Right.
And, like for the most part, does like kind of learned apathy. The way my team like to describe it is make reversible decisions quickly. Right. So anything that's not like stuck in stone, just like do it and fix it later kind of thing. I think VP hiring is one of those where that's not the case. You really have to be very intentional about it. I think at this point, from what I've seen, I think there very clearly is like a startup VPE like definition of a role, that it's like a very good role to exist. And I think like it's its own thing from like a VP at a bigger company. I think you run into trouble when people say like, I need a VPE when they really just need, like, for example, an eng manager, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're just like, I have too many reports, they go hire a VPE. Or on the flip side, when they actually do need a VPE, but they need like a startup VPE, and they just go find someone with the title of VP at a bigger company and assume it's the same role, right? So I think it's like, there's some of these things where like there should probably be a better title for the startup version, but like startup VPE actually is a thing these days, I think now. And it's often people who are kind of like, senior eng managers or like directors at bigger companies. Maybe they have like one line of managers under them, between them and the ICs, right? And I think, again, like at startups, like that person, I think really just has two jobs, right? One is like, make sure we are like getting the absolute most of the team we have. And two is like, make sure we're growing that team as fast as we possibly can, right? In the early days, that's going to be the job of the founders. But at some point, especially as a tech company, as your engineering team starts scaling and you're hiring a lot of ICs, CEO can't be, recruiting from start to finish every engineer. I think that's the point you're bringing a VP in, and you say like, you're like I don't care. You're not worried about the product. Like your product is the engineering team, right? And what I care about is like maximal efficiency and like growing it as fast as possible and getting creative on how to do that. I think when you need to like outsource that part of your job, a startup VP is a great person to hire.
Mm-hmm.
When it's more concerns around like, management of individuals or like, thinking about the product, the roadmap or anything, I think we'll often jump to that kind of VP hire. But I agree in those cases, while those might be the responsibility of a VP at a bigger company, it's the wrong hire to make at this stage.
This actually gets back to a different question you asked, which was difference between startups and bigger companies. One of the things which I always thought was interesting at bigger companies was there was always a ladder. Like there was always a run book, right? It's like, this problem has emerged. This is how we solve it at this company. And so I think one of the things that you spend a lot of time doing at an early stage company is you're like, this problem has emerged. We don't know how to solve it. Here are many ways we may solve it. And then there's a question of, I joke about this with like, we have a community Slack of about 8,000 developers right now. We get a lot of support questions in there. Like, hey, the product doesn't do X, or I want to do Y. And we have this option of like, do we move to a better system for 8,000 people? Do we hire someone to do this? Do we do whatever? I think that VPEs and eng managers are a very similar thing where at a big company, it's like, we have a new org of 100 or 200 people. It needs a director. We will now promote and or find a director. You don't see that at a startup. At a startup, you kind of need to like figure out what that is for yourself. Thing number two, which I think was very interesting, which is different, is that at least at Facebook, if you made a big enough fire, so for example, like if you had enough people that didn't have a manager, there would literally be a team spun up to solve this problem, right? Like someone would eventually be like, there's scope and impact in solving this problem. I'm going to go solve it. And so it would just like emerge from some other part of the org and you wouldn't really know where it came from, but it would solve the problem. That is not true at a startup. If you make a big enough fire, the house burns down. That's how it works, right? It's like fire, burn down. And so I think learning how to navigate that and being like, oh, wow, my decisions have real impacts have been one of the bigger learnings of a startup. Is like, I think at a big company, you can be shielded from a lot of this. If you can make a lot of poor decisions and other parts of the org will sort of like carry the weight, I think that is made incredibly evident to you at a startup.
Yeah.
I like the notion of like a bigger company just by like scale is like more like an efficient market. Like anywhere you find alpha in like, scope or impact to be had, someone dives in. Whereas like a startup is like, it's like 6 people sitting in a room is not really enough to make an efficient market. So like there's no one to fill those gaps. And if they don't get handled, like Tomas said, the company just blows up.
Tomas, you also brought up a point in our previous intro call of like, for folks that have maybe only worked in startups, it's tougher for them to let go of ownership and be able to delegate, right? Like, I think that's something that you pick up on Facebook. It's like you get a lot of folks you can delegate to, but for owners or tech leaders, it's tough to have that, you got to have that trust to be able to say like, yeah, you're right. This is time for you to take over this task.
It's funny. I think that I think in startup land, there's a lot of hate towards big companies. Perhaps it's just our own DNA. We actually really love people that used to work at big companies because we think that there's a lot of good they bring to the table. Some of them for us.
It's a necessary hate because like, if you're not spending all your time dumping on big companies, how are you ever going to hire people who are thinking about going there? Some of it ends up being like there's a strong incentive for like the startup community in general to be like, no, big companies suck. Don't go work there. Come work for us.
Right.
Possibly, yeah. But I think you're pointing out there are a few things I've noticed from big companies that I like. One of them is I think that people who have been in startups their entire career have a strong aversion to process. And as Yasyf said, you should lazy load process, but that does mean eventually it gets introduced. Right. And the startup folk, I think, at least the people I've worked with who have only been at startups are like, we should never have a process here. Or if they do need to have a process, they don't know what it should look like. For one of the ones which I think we think a lot about is like, what is our North Star for on-call? Right? Or hiring or something like this. These are companies that if you've come from a big company, you hear this and you're like, we have a wiki page about how to do that. Right. And if you're only a startup, you're like, you just kind of do what feels right. And so the value of process there is interesting. The second one I think is, so having that like North Star, both in like, what should we have for tooling? What should we have for process? What should we have for workflows? Whatever you have. I think the other one, which I think is very interesting, is I think at a big company, a lot of the time you've had a lot more time to be very thoughtful about these processes. And a startup, this is common wisdom. Everything feels a little hair on fire all the time. And so finding those people who have been like, no, I've actually had a lot of time to be thoughtful around how we should architect systems or how we should hire people or how we should do whatever is really, really valuable and hard to find the space to do at a startup.
Cool.
Totally agree.
I do take a little bit of exception with some of that. We were talking about startup VP. I finally get to talk because we've been having some audio issues. I think this is the first time I've said anything since the pairing. Because I mean, I've spent most of my career in startups, VP of engineering startups. And what I've learned is I agree that a lot of people who've only spent their time in startups struggle with process. I actually think that there's a lot of people who are in startups and look at companies like Google and others and are like, well, that's what they do. That's what we should be doing. Mm-hmm. And so they want to take these big company processes, even though they've never even worked at the big company, and try to apply them at the small company. Right. And then similarly, the people I've worked with in startups for a long period of time. And I think this is where, getting back to what a startup VP of engineering looks like, they've been at startups. They've been there. They've known that. So I come in with a playbook on what interviewing should look like at this stage, at the 0 to 5 stage. This is what our hiring kind of should look like in our interview process. As we grow, we should have this type of process. And I think that if you can find the right people with that background, you're great. And I agree that they're hard to find. I'm not suggesting in any way that they're like a dime a dozen. But at the same time, I don't know that I necessarily agree that it's a big company thing, small company thing. I think there's just some people who have a very pragmatic approach to process, who see it as a tool and scale it. And then there's others that like glom onto whatever, or, so
I think you're totally right. I actually think you're like super right about this, but I think where that comes from is you stay at a startup long enough to see the impacts of your decisions. So you make a decision, you make it wrong, you learn from it. And I think if you've spent like even 3 months at a big company, you osmosis a lot of that because the history is written down for you. It's like, why do we interview this way? Well, we tried these other ways. This is how they failed for us. And so you can learn from their mistakes as opposed to, I think the people at startups have had to like learn from their own or stay there for long enough to see the value.
Right. I think it's kind of like, it's almost summed up in a way of like the benefit of being in the bigger company is not necessarily seeing exactly what their process is. You can mimic it, but it's seeing what good looks like. So you know what that looks like when you achieve that or what you should aspire to at your own company, right? Like it's not necessarily Google does this and therefore we should do it, but it's more like, oh, like when Google's shit was really working, this is what it felt like. Like that doesn't feel like it when we added this process here. So like clearly this is not the right fit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the other piece of that is, like, it's also, to Tomas's point, people have worked only at startups their whole life. Like, sometimes they don't see the value of those things. So they've never seen, it's like, they got like someone who's never had a good manager will like be like, oh, like managers are useless. It's like they never benefit anyone. But you just haven't seen what good management can do, right? So I think it's similar. Like, if you've never seen these things be functional, it's very easy to just write it off and be like, yeah, big companies are all horribly inefficient because like I've never seen any process that works well, right? And so I think that there is some value in being able to see, oh, actually, like the right tool applied at the right time can be helpful.
Yasyf, have you, when you were, I guess, maybe weighing options on, working for a bigger company at one point, what were the things that you were taking into consideration in terms of comparing like Facebook versus Google or anything in particular that jumped out to you?
Yeah, it's funny because this is a lesson I had to relearn in startup land, but I think I had figured it out in big company land, which is like, it's all about the people, right? Like, you can find interesting challenges on basically anything you work on. Like, bigger companies have enough variance that like there's always like some team that you're going to find exciting or some subject area that's going to be interesting, something you need to learn. But I think, something I took for granted until I was the one who had to hire my entire team is like, when you're going to a big company, you actually get to pick the people you're working with and know that before you agree to work with them, which is like such an incredible like thing, right? Now the lives Tomas and I live, it's like we hire someone and we think we know what it's like to work with them, but don't actually know until we start. And so I think being able to really be picky about the people you choose to work with and the team you surround yourself with is all I was really thinking about those bigger companies. And it's all I would recommend anyone really focus on is like, you have the chance to be very picky about these people, like take advantage of that.
And what about like the team that you wanted to work with? Is it kind of what you're alluding to? Like one of the founders that we had on previously on this topic said that they were able to work on a very specific project that they knew was going to be applicable to the next startup they started, and so they wanted to get that specific exposure, and that's why they elected to go down a certain path.
A little bit skeptical of that. I guess there's like, there's definitely some world where like you work on something specific and then you go spin out a company that is exactly like that. And there's a few popular Silicon Valley, growth stage companies I can think of that are exactly that. Mm-hmm. But more often, I think it's like what happened with Tomas and the Graphite team, where it's like they weren't working on the code review tools of Facebook, but they got exposed to them, and that kind of like inspired something, right? Or and with lots of other companies, there was some process or some problem they got exposed to at scale. I'm not actually sure that the process of being very intentional, like I'm going to go work on exactly this team because I want to start a company that solves exactly this problem, is actually that practical most of the time. Like starting companies just are rarely that intentional. Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Tomas did.
Thank you. I've said this before. I'm always very skeptical of people I hear who are leaving a company are like, I know what I'm going to do, and we're not going to have to pivot. That to me is like, oh, cool, you haven't done this before.
Disaster. It's like there's nothing more dangerous than a founder who's like a little bit too emotionally attached to the thing that they haven't actually proven anyone wants, right? It's like even more dangerous than like the build it and they will come founder, because this one is like this founder will actively ignore signs from the market that this is like not a thing you should be spending time on. And I think it's such a good way for like really smart people to waste a lot of time.
You need some level of that, right? Of like the blind ambition, or some level of willing to take a leap.
Blind ambition, but I totally agree with you. Like blind obsession with a particular direction.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. I think, and I mean, to be fair, like we definitely fell into this trap. We were like, we've totally validated this idea. I just remember our seed stage pitch being like, this is totally validated. We don't need, like, we're good to go. We understand it. And I think our wiser investors were always like, like definitely. And you kind of see it as you play out of, I think I've come around to, I think the only validation that matters is if you had all the validation you want, you would already be making revenue at scale. Right. And anything short of that, you don't have the validation. Yeah. You're working towards it.
Although you did make a really good point there. Like, I feel like the one caveat to all this is when you're fundraising, you have to believe that like this is the hill to die on and you will die on it, and this is the most brilliant idea ever and you're the perfect team to build it. I feel like it's one of those unspoken things where like if you're a good founder, you obviously know that's not strictly true. If you're a good investor, you always know it's not strictly true. You kind of have to play this game where both of you really believe it to get over the line of like, handing a few $1 million to like 3 people,
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I do want to kind of put a bow on it here and transition us into this final segment because it's coming up on that hour. So let's go ahead and make this pivot. So we're rolling out this new segment called 5-Second Scramble. So I'm going to ask each of you just a series of questions, and you give me your response within 5 seconds. It's kind of like a rapid fire Q&A. Some will be business, some personal. I'm going to start with you, Yasyf. So as a founder, leader of a startup, what is the number one thing that you would say that keeps you up at night?
There's a term for this. I forget what it is. Basically, the idea that like, as CEO or as founder, it's always your job to look over the next horizon of the company. So every time you accomplish something as a company, well, everyone else is celebrating. It's your job to say, okay, what's the next thing we have to do? But like the result of that is you're always feeling like you're behind because like you're the person who knows what has to come next. And so it's this constant struggle where you never feel like you're keeping up and you always feel like as a company you're behind. And I think that I struggle with a lot because you kind of have to like live with that and use the learnings from that while not like stressing everyone else out, and that tension definitely keeps me up at night.
Cool. What's the number one trait you look for in people when hiring to a startup?
Ooh. I think if you had asked me that a few years ago, I would have said something around like grit or hustle or like just like whatever the opposite of like helplessness is, like they'll just solve the problem. I think if you were to ask me today, I would actually say like kindness and a willing to invest in the people around you. I think like the best people I've hired are not 10 out of 10 engineers who like really hustle. Those people are great. Best people I've hired are the ones who, 10x the entire team every time they enter a room. Those are the kind of people I want to be hiring in the early stage.
Cool. Like that. What's more important to you, meaningful work or more compensation?
I feel like that's if any of us cared about conversation, we would not be doing the jobs we're doing right now. So I think the answer to that one's pretty obvious.
Favorite country you've ever traveled to?
Ooh, that's a really tricky one. I was in Malaysia recently and had some like some of the best street food in my life. So I think Malaysia is the top currently. But if you ask me that question next month, it'll probably change.
Most disgusting food item you've ever eaten?
In Iceland, they have fermented whale, and it's like one of the national dishes. And it's one of those things where everyone's like, oh, every country has like some gross dish and like, or it seems gross and you try it and it's not that bad. But fermented whale is actually like truly terrible. Sorry to any Icelandic people listening. But like,
fermented whale.
That's barely sat on my stomach for like 2 seconds before it came right back out.
Just throw a little Frank's Red Hot on it. And
yeah.
Good to go.
Favorite app on your phone?
Oh man, I gotta open my phone and look. I don't know. I don't use my phone often enough now. I'm probably Superhuman because it lets me feel a tiny bit less stressed when I'm going through my emails. But I think it's a pretty weak answer. I don't
know. Cool. All right. Well, let's jump over to you now, Tomas. We'll start with what problems are you solving at Graphite?
Code review for fast-moving teams.
Who are your users?
Any developer.
What type of engineer thrives at Graphite?
People who are thoughtful around the developer workflow and looking to solve hard problems.
What's your favorite aspect of working at Graphite?
Oh God, probably the people. I love the team. It's one of our teammates said it really well recently. It's very rare to work at a company where you, 1, know everyone, and 2, like everyone.
That's the right answer. What is the number one trait you look for in a co-founder?
Oh, good question. I think some level of ambition here still. It's hard. It's somewhere between ambition and like I would never found with a non-friend, and then among my friends, I think it's ambition. But the friendship is definitely the first one. Trust is probably the real answer then.
Trust is a good one.
Do you think it's actually friendship, or is it more like mutual respect?
For us, I think it's a form of trust. It's the trust that you have that like extends past work, right? Like I think there's something really powerful of like, my co-founders and I maybe have a disagreement or don't see eye to eye on something. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we can be like, let's hang out as friends and like put this down and come back to this later is the most critical thing. And you can have that with people you have mutual respect with who aren't necessarily your friends. But there is some level of like trust and willing to put it downness.
Like that's hard to find out. This together no matter what, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're actually going to run an episode on that because it's called the co-founder connection. Because I think it's so interesting too. If you look at like companies that have just two co-founders and then some that have 4 or 5, right? Like, is there more disputes or what is more better? Favorite city in the U.S.?
Ooh, Boston, where I grew up.
You prefer
your choice.
You prefer your eggs fried or scrambled?
Fried.
Favorite Disney character?
It's a good one. I don't know if I have a good one right now. I'm really struggling on this one. Who's my favorite Disney character? Drawn from that. So Tarzan was my favorite movie. So I'll give you that for now.
Okay. We'll take Tarzan.
Wait,
Yasyf, what's your favorite
character though, or someone else?
I don't know. This is a good one.
Answer this while you're thinking.
I feel like the character I like the most of all the movies is probably Simba. But if I had to be like, which movie did I actually see the most as a child? It was Tarzan. I used to watch that like every other day when I was 3. So there's that.
Yasyf, what's your answer?
I think Mr. Potato Head from Toy Story. His life seems pretty great,
So.
I can it sounds like a pretty good life.
Yeah, I'm a big Aladdin fan.
Aladdin's not a bad one either. You know what? I'm gonna change my answer to Aladdin. I feel like Aladdin, I'm always getting in trouble.
Come on, join the Aladdin fan party.
I also want to end my earlier answer about my favorite app on my phone. So I've recently been getting really into this new kind of second brain note-taking app called Mem, and I strongly recommend everyone check it out. It is really cool. I don't know if you guys like try to use Roam or any of these other kind of like note-taking apps, but Mem is like finally the one I've been searching for many, many years, and it has been life-changing.
Sweet. Just wrote it down. Cool. I think that's everything. Mike, did you have any other anything that you wanted to say? You got about 2 words in this episode.
Yeah, no, it's been good. It's my I guess for my next one will be podcasts and silence. Will be my next one.
Yeah. That was this has been by far the most interesting recording as far as like the shuffle of folks.
Yeah.
Again,
musical chairs.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. It's been really helpful, super interesting stuff, and we're excited to push it live.
Sweet.
All right, cheers, guys. Thanks for taking time.
Cheers.